We'll have our weekly reading. The reading from Rays of the One Light, weekly commentaries on the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita by Swami Kriyananda. Week 36, ego, friend or foe. Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it and your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. Jesus Christ begins his Beatitudes with the words, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." To be poor in spirit in such a way as to merit the kingdom of heaven doesn't mean to be poor-spirited. Rather, it means to see oneself as owning nothing, since all belongs to God. For all is a manifestation of his consciousness. St. John of the Cross wrote, "If you would own everything, seek to own nothing. That which the ego relinquishes, offering it up to soul consciousness, is reclaimed forever in cosmic consciousness. Nothing is ever lost." Paramahansa Yogananda tells the story in the autobiography of a yogi of the levitating saint Bahaduri Mahasaya. "Master," said a disciple of this saint once ardently, "you are wonderful. You have renounced riches and comforts to seek God and teach us wisdom." It was well known that Bahaduri Mahasaya had forsaken great family wealth in his early childhood, when single-mindedly he entered the yogic path. "You are reversing the case," the saint's face held mild rebuke. "I have left a few paltry rupees, a few petty pleasures, for a cosmic empire of endless bliss. How then have I denied myself anything? I know the joy of sharing the treasure. Is that a sacrifice?" The short-sighted worldly folk are verily the real renunciates. They relinquish an unparalleled divine possession for a poor handful of earthly toys. The Bhagavad Gita in the 3rd chapter states, "All things are everywhere by nature wrought, an interaction of the qualities. The fool cheated by self thinks this I did, and that I wrought. But thou strong-armed prince, a better lessoned mind, knowing the play of visible things within the world of sense, and how the qualities must qualify, standeth aloof even from his acts. Thus through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind." Good morning. Start out with a reading from Whispers from Eternity, Yogananda's beautiful book of prayer demands and poems. And today I'm reading number 208. Thou didst reveal thy silver rays of speaking silence. Divine Mother, I heard thy voice in the speaking fragrance of the rose. I heard thy voice in the lisping whispers of my devotion. I heard thy voice beneath the din of my noisiest thoughts. It was thy love which spoke through the voice of friendship. I touched thy tenderness in the softness of the lily. O Divine Mother, break through the dawn and show thy face of light. Break through the sun and show thy face of power. Break through the night and show thy mooned face. Break through my thoughts and show thy face of wisdom. Break through my feelings and show thy face of love. Break through my pride and show thy face of humbleness.
Break through my wisdom and show thy face of perfection. As I called to thee in the wilderness of my loneliness, thou didst burst through the dawn to greet me with thy joy. Thou didst emerge from the molten door of the sun to invigorate me through the pores of my life. Thou didst tear away the night of my ignorance to reveal thy silver rays of speaking silence. And that's how we find God, is through silence. 2 weeks ago, I think it was 2 weeks ago, it might have been 3 now, my family and I were on our annual vacation in Martha's Vineyard. And as soon as we got there on Sunday night, around 5 o'clock, we went to the beach. And my daughter and I took a walk towards the cliffs in Aquina. And it was a beautiful night, blue sky and white clouds, and the sun was shining. And in the distance, we could see this really strange, long cloud. It almost looked like a tornado on its side horizontally. And we both were a little bit surprised to see it. It was quite beautiful. It was a silvery gray color. And it stretched across the horizon as far as we could see. And maybe some of you saw it in Rhode Island because it was coming from Rhode Island towards the vineyard. So we just walked about 1.5 miles towards the cliffs, and we saw this cloud coming towards us. It was really, really unusual and unique. And I found out later that it is very unusual. It's called an Arcus roll cloud, and they are quite rare. And it's usually when a cloud breaks off a cold front that's coming. So anyway, we were just enjoying the evening, and then we turned around and started walking back. We walked about 1.5 miles. And on the way back, we met some people with some really cute Jack Russell Terriers. So we stopped to play with the dogs and talk to them. Then we continued to walk. And all of a sudden, it started to get really, really dark. The light just shifted very quickly. And my daughter said, "Mom, look behind us." And we turned around, and that beautiful silvery cloud was quite close to us, and it was jet black. And within a minute, it consumed us. We were in it. And I looked over at the ocean, and the ocean was black. There was only this much space between the bottom of the cloud and the ocean. And my first response was fear. I became really anxious and really frightened. There had been a big lightning storm earlier in the day, and I just thought, okay, we're going to get struck by lightning. So we came away from the water, and I said to Ellis, if it starts to lightning, let's lay down in the sand dunes. That's probably the safest, because we had 1 mile to go on our walk. And then immediately after that, I just started to pray. Thank you, God, for keeping us safe. Thank you, Divine Mother. And I started practicing japa. And then this peacefulness came through me. I started to surrender into the moment, into the beauty, because it was, even though it was like a little bit terrifying, it was also really unusual and really beautiful. And as we kept walking, and I kept that internal dialogue with God going, suddenly after about 5 or 6 minutes, the sun started to come out, and that black edge of the cloud was now in front of us. And we just watched it really quickly blow off. It was really like quite a stunning thing. And I wanted to start with that story this morning because it really shows you the difference between ego consciousness, being in ego consciousness, and being in spirit. And today's reading is ego, friend or foe. And my ego consciousness brought me right into fear and anxiety and contraction. I started to contract and get nervous. But then as soon as I turned to God, I started to feel peaceful and at ease. And of course, if something's happening, we have to protect ourselves. That's a normal reaction. But in the end, there was really no danger. But it was interesting to me how that's what happens to us. And that's just a metaphor for life, because, life will be sailing along, and then all of a sudden some type of really dark storm, metaphorically, will come into our lives. And all we can do is just put our trust in God, to turn to God and relax into it. And soon enough, that cloud will pass. The sun will come out again, because everything in life is temporary. It's really important. And that was a really powerful lesson for me to kind of see this happening. Guru Priya was here last week with Om Shanti, and it was really beautiful to have them here. And Guru Priya said something that we've heard many times before, but when you sometimes hear it in a fresh way, it really, really struck me. She said, to be inspired is to be in spirit. And that's really what we're talking about, to stay in spirit, to let the ego consciousness float away and to keep our consciousness in align with spirit, with God. That's a little catchy tune that's happening. That's okay. We're just all in spirit. And but you know, the ego is just the soul identified with the body. So even that experience I had on the beach was my ego, my soul being identified more with my physical body, worrying about the harm. But when, again, we move into spirit, we just feel that this is a dream world. You know, this really is all Brahma's dream. And even though we perceive everything in this world as being so real, when we leave this body and our consciousness moves on to the next plane, we just see it for what it was, which was a place for us to learn and grow. So we asked the question today, ego, friend, or foe? And in last week's reading, there was a line, the ego is a way station on the soul's journey toward enlightenment. And that's so true, because we can't be embodied. We can't be a soul in a body without an ego. We need that. And when the soul inhabits a human body, it gains self-consciousness. And that's the highest self too. But before we can get to that awareness of self, capital S consciousness, we have to go through ego consciousness. And one of the great spiritual truths is that before we can transcend ego consciousness, we have to develop the ego in a really powerful way. And that takes many, many lifetimes. And many of us would probably say in this lifetime, if we look back when we were younger, there was probably a time in our life where we had a really, really powerful defined ego. And it's that powerful defined ego that makes us start to realize that nothing in the material world makes us happy. You know, that the material objects, the things that we think, the success we want to attain, whatever it is, the love relationships, eventually we start to realize that everything loses its power to us. Everything loses that sparkle. And we realize that the only thing that we really want is God. And that's where we start our journey to self-realization, to this beautiful self-awareness and consciousness. And in today's reading, the Beatitudes, they're so beautiful. These were Jesus's instructions to his disciples. He called his disciples up. This is the Sermon of the Mount, and he invited his disciples up, and he gave the Beatitudes, and they really are directions on how to transform from ego consciousness to this great Christ consciousness. And if you read them, you see, you know, the one that we have today is blessed are the poor in spirit. And what that means is that when we start to release the ego consciousness and live in spirit, we become more powerful. And then all of those little worldly attachments fall away. You know, we're not as worried about the things of the material world, and we're able to be more expansive. So unlike my experience on the beach where I became contracted and afraid, the more we live in spirit, we become beautifully expansive, and we see everything that comes to us as a gift from God. One of the other things to think about, to be poor in spirit, is a practice of relinquishing ownership. And it's not just material things, but it's also ownership of our thoughts and our deeds, because everything comes from God. And we have to be careful. Sometimes we can think, well, I did this, or I thought that, and I brought this to the party or to the table, whatever it is we're talking about. But really, everything comes from God. And, you know, I believe it was in today's reading of the Bhagavad Gita, everything in this world is a manifestation of God's consciousness, and that thoughts are universally, not individually rooted. That's something that Yogananda said all the time. You know, when James and I were younger, we used to go to estate sales. My husband is an antique dealer, and we'd go to estate sales, and you would go into this is when someone passed away and their estate would be up for auction. And sometimes the people didn't have any relatives. So you'd walk into these houses and everything was just like the person walked out to get a cup of coffee. Like everything was the same in the house. And it was a little bit sad, but there's nothing that makes you realize that you can't take it with you when you go, until you go into one of those situations and you just realize, you'd see people's treasured collections and just so many different things. And you realize like all that love and care that went into collecting or to keeping things a certain way. In the end, it doesn't matter, and that's true. So in addition to the material possessions, we want to release ownership, but we also want to release ownership of the things that we think that are inspired through our own thoughts and mind, when in actuality, all of that comes from God. It's God's inspiration. So it can be hard to practice this, this real letting go of ownership on all levels. And in today's Gita reading, Krishna tells Arjuna, all things are everywhere by nature wrought, which is to say, again, that every thought, every inspiration, and every idea that comes to us originates from God. Nothing is from us, really. We're just channels and instruments for this divine energy to flow through. If we're living in ego consciousness, we block that out. And then we start to live from ego consciousness. But when we live in spirit, we start to become a channel for this beautiful energy of God's light and love. And again, Yogananda said that thoughts are universally, not individually rooted. So we can think that, when we're meditating in that silence, sometimes we have these impressions, these inspirations that come to us, and those are from God. They're directly from God, and those are the ones we want to act on. Sometimes when they come, we cut them off right away because the ego comes in and says, well, I don't want to do that, or I don't like that. And that's what we want to be careful of. We want to become sort of an ego detective. We want to really start to question the thoughts and the feelings. And are they coming from spirit, or are they coming from ego? So going back to this thought of living in spirit, we meditate twice a day, and we can think of that as our bookends. We make this appointment with God. We make a connection with God. We keep our promise to God. But it's really all that time in between all day long that really matters. That's when it's most challenging to stay in spirit. And that's what we want to be really conscious of, to think of God throughout the day, to talk to God as a friend, and to really let that span between the meditation times really guide us in our daily lives, because that's the most powerful part. When we're interacting with other people, when we're at our jobs, when we're out in the world, we want to be channels for that light. So just remember that it's those minutes and hours in between the very specific time that we dedicate to God in our meditation practice. There's a practice that it's really powerful and it's really hard to do. And we've talked about this here before, but trying not to use the word I as much. And it's so hard. And I have to say the word I now, and I'm becoming conscious of it. So at work, I have to communicate with my colleagues by email quite a bit. So it's actually easier to do it through email and through writing, because you have a minute to pause and you can write things out without using I, And it's so interesting what happens when you start doing that, especially when you're working with other people. It really shifts the energy. It becomes more collaborative and more expansive, and people respond to each other in a different way. And then when you do have to say the word I, because of course we have to say it, at least for me now, when I say it, I start to ask myself, who am I? Who is the I that I'm talking about? Is it this body and this personality? I want it to be the I of God. I want it to be the I am, because that's what we practice in this tradition. The Hong Sa technique is I am spirit. And when you really strip it down, it's simply I am, meaning that I am part of everything. I am God. God flows through me. Every molecule of creation, including me, is God. So that's a really beautiful thing to think about. So maybe you can try that this week. And just, it's a funny thing, because when you really put your mind to it, it's like every 2 seconds, you're like, oh, I did it again. It's really hard. So that's how, again, the soul identified with the body is what the ego is. We're just so identified with this casing that we have to be in this body to be in this world. And it's a blessing too. So ego, friend or foe, in some ways the ego is our friend because we couldn't be in this beautiful life without it. And it's through this beautiful life that we start to transcend and we come closer to God. And just to end, there's a guru in India who would pelt rocks at his disciples. He'd just throw rocks at them. And because the disciples loved him so much and felt in attunement with him, they didn't get upset, but instead they'd gather all the rocks and they'd put them in their pockets. And they would go home and they'd find out that those rocks had turned into nuggets of gold. And it's a beautiful metaphor, isn't it? That when the hard rocks of life hit us and pelt us, if we stay in attunement with the guru, if we stay in attunement with God, we start to realize that all of those difficult things in life are for our spiritual growth. And when we come out on the other side of it, the way that, my daughter and I had that experience of this storm blowing over us and we came out on the other side, you realize that everything is temporary in life. Everything has its time, everything just comes and goes. And when we stay in spirit, when we stay with God throughout all of it, then we can navigate any storm in life. We can just move through the world in spirit. And God is our treasure. That's the bottom line. So when we think about non-attachment and letting go, God is our wealth. God is our treasure. God is our life. God is our love. Peace. Amen.